So thank you all for coming out on this particularly cold day. I'm hoping this is an unusually, no, I'm getting some, no. I saw the cold weather this morning. I thought, oh, I hope people can come out. And then I saw everybody walking around like it's normal. So I was pleased to see that you all made it out. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to talk about something that I'm very excited about, which is a somewhat new tool for educational research and for educational researchers who are focused on the qualitative tradition. Today I'm going to talk to you about give you a little bit of background on QCA as it's commonly referred to, talk to you about what it's intended to do and how it actually works, and then I'm going to give you an overview of how I've used it in a forthcoming paper that's coming out on a study that I am conducting with Professor Janelle Scott at UC Berkeley, a national study of Teach for America alumni's career patterns or career pathways. So with that in mind, wanted to give you a little bit of background on why I use this particular method. So I am a mixed methods researcher, but I do primarily qualitative work. I really enjoy quantitative work. I really enjoy quantitative work, and so I'm oftentimes trying to find ways to bridge the two. I've done some mixed methods studies, and what I found oftentimes is that it's sometimes difficult to have the data speak to each other in a way that still maintains the integrity of the quantitative and the qualitative data. At the same time, I found that when I'm studying urban schools, particularly when I get inside of classrooms, it's challenging to arrive at certain types of conclusions based on the qualitative data that I have. It's also challenging to arrive at other conclusions with quantitative data. In particular, I found that I can go, as you well know, I can go deep, in depth into a localized case study. Use various forms of qualitative data and bring that to bear on my analysis, or I can look broadly across urban schools and urban classrooms and look at a broad but not a deep data set and look at broad patterns. But I still feel like I'm missing something when I'm trying to understand the strength of different qualitative patterns that I see. So I found that there are certain methodological challenges to studying education, and in particular to studying urban education in an urban context. So one of the major challenges is that there are multiple factors that shape outcomes, as you know. So anytime you walk into an urban school, you're going to see that there are more than one reform efforts at play at any single moment. And how do we disentangle all the effects of these different reform efforts on the outcomes that we're interested in? And at the same time, I'm a policy analyst. So I also know that even outside of the school or the district where I'm looking, or the schools that I'm studying, there are multiple policies that are affecting how principals and teachers and families behave inside the schools, right? And so we have multiple reforms creating what is oftentimes referred to in the literature as reform turbulence. We have competing policies or overlapping policies, and it's difficult to disentangle all of them. And at the same time, we have the realities of urban context. We have high poverty communities. We have communities that include primarily families of color. We have high numbers of immigrant families in certain communities. We have English learners in very high numbers in certain urban contexts. All of these demographic conditions combine to make reform or school improvement challenging in urban contexts. But from a research perspective, all of these contextual influences or realities make it difficult to disentangle exactly what happened and which pathways really did lead to which outcomes. So this is sort of where I was stuck in my thinking about sort of how I wanted to sort of reapproach some of my data analysis in my work. At the same time, we know that schools are complex social places, right? We're looking at social phenomena, so they're not straightforward. And we know that we rarely, if ever, find a single, very parsimonious set of factors that will predict 100% of the variance in an outcome. Most likely, we can be cautious in our claims about a set of certain factors that may be related to a certain outcome, right? And that's okay, because we have inherent limitations built into the kind of evidence that we can bring to bear on our work. Right? We have certain limitations in quantitative data. We have issues around multicollinearity. We look at interaction effects oftentimes in inferential statistics, but that can be, those interaction effects can be undermined by multicollinearity and other issues. Right? And you have, and in quantitative work, we typically sacrifice a degree of depth, right, in our data. In our qualitative data, we necessarily use a small number of cases, not always, sometimes a medium size, but it's smaller in range, and therefore we forego a degree of breadth. So we're always dealing with evidence that is constrained. So I was looking for, so I've been looking for methods that will help me address these inherent limitations that I can't erase, but that I can at least try to address with different tools. At the same time, you also have certain epistemological challenges to studying schools in urban settings, right? And we have these competing paradigms, these assumptions that are built into these different research traditions. Now, I'm not a large fan of binaries, and I think they tend to oversimplify the discussion that we have, but in general, when we look at the quantitative research tradition, we know from Guba and Lincoln and others, and your upcoming, and Eisenhardt, who was here, and Anderson's work, and I think Erickson was named as coming to talk. We know that we strip our analyses of a degree of contextualized knowledge when we look purely across large quantitative data sets. Right? We also have this dualism built into many large-scale data analyses or large-scale quantitative research studies, where we assume that there's a duality where we can separate the researcher from the research. Right? We can take out our subjective interpretations of what's happening. That's an assumption, at least, that's built in, and we look deep, and we we're expected to derive our knowledge about what's happening deductively. Now, in the qualitative tradition, as you know, here we assume that our understandings are bound to the context, right? It's context-specific work and analysis that we engage in. And here we don't expect our researchers to separate themselves from the research participants, but in fact, we expect to derive our understandings from the interaction between the two, right? And this is the inductive research process. And at the same time, we also know that all the data and the standards for evidence that we bring to bear on our questions, they're based on they're actually based on qualitative judgments. Both of them are, right? Which cutoff do we pick for statistical analyses? Which participants do we sample and which do not? These are still qualitative in nature, and they're judgment calls at the end of the day. So there's always a degree of subjectivity and very important substantive knowledge that goes into the decisions that we make as researchers. And both types of data can at times be used for exploratory purposes or descriptive purposes, and even confirmatory, cautiously confirmatory purposes as well. Okay, so we have both methodological and epistemological considerations that we make and judgments that we make as researchers. When we are studying schools in an urban context, and we know that there are multiple realities and contextual conditions at play, all of these assumptions just become more amplified in the decisions that we make. So enter qualitative comparative analysis. So in the political science field, Charles Reagan introduced this method in the 80s. He was studying the outcomes related to democracy across different countries. And he was trying to understand the different conditions inside countries that were associated with different outcomes with their forms of democracy. Okay. Now, he could have looked at one country and tried to understand what was associated with these outcomes, and he could have, or what conditions were associated with certain democratic outcomes, and he could have stopped there. But he looked across many countries, and he had qualitative data, and he said it's difficult to disentangle all the different pathways to democracy that I see across these countries. So he developed a tool for identifying multiple combinations of conditions that are associated with a given outcome. And this tool carries specific advantages over both case-oriented traditional qualitative research, as well as traditional inferential quantitative resource in that it allows the researcher to analyze more cases. So suddenly you can go from a small n to a medium size n. Rather than looking at 3 cases, you can look at 8 cases, you can look at 50 cases, you can sometimes even look at 100 cases, okay? It also carries an advantage in that QCA brings the issue of context to the fore. Right? Now recall with traditional inferential statistics, we lose a degree of contextualized understandings. This allows us to keep contextual conditions in the model, if you will, even though it's not a model exactly. And it does this by using Boolean algebra. Do we have any mathematics educators in here? Former math majors? No? Okay. It uses Boolean algebra to surface multiple combinations of conditions rather than rely on the interaction effects that we would usually use if we were looking at a large-scale data set, or rather than relying on single in-depth combinations of conditions that we would see in a single case study. So how do we actually do this? What does this tool look like? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to pick a case. So you select a case that you're going to compare to other cases. That case can be a teacher, that case can be a student, that case can be an instructional task, that case can be a career outcome, like I'm going to share in an example that I'll use to illustrate this tool in a second. You first need to decide what case you want to compare to other cases. And after that, you need to decide, okay, what conditions do I think shape what's happening in this case? And you choose that based on your own substantive knowledge of the phenomenon that you're studying. Okay, not just theoretical knowledge, but you also base it on what the theory would predict. So one of the advantages about QCA is it allows you to bring certain contextual understandings into your work, and at the same time to also infuse those understandings with what you know about the cases or the phenomenon that you're studying because of what you've experienced through the research process. So it's not completely bounded to predefined theoretical, a predefined theoretical frame. And then you need to define your outcome. What result is it that you're interested in looking at? And after that, then you go through 3 steps, which is essentially a calibration step, an analysis step, and then what we call a minimization step in QCA. And the first step is that you want to, when you calibrate, you look at all of your conditions. You say, okay, here are 4 conditions that I think are going to be associated with outcome. Say race, class, the longevity of a principal, for example, and teachers' years of experience. And you can either categorize, you can either create categorical values for these conditions, or you can just dichotomize them. And in the example I'm about to share, this is a dichotomized calibration procedure. And then you create truth tables. And so I asked if we had any math educators or any math majors in here who had used Boolean algebra before or studied Boolean algebra before. And you use truth tables that are essentially spreadsheets that show which conditions are associated with every outcome, and they allow you to essentially count, or they count for you, how many, which condition, or how many times certain combinations of conditions are associated with your outcome of interest. Okay? And we're going to make this concrete in just a moment. I just want to make sure we get the steps out first. And then after you see which combinations of conditions are associated with your outcome, then you have an opportunity to reduce all those sets of conditions to the most parsimonious combinations of conditions by eliminating any redundancy that you see through the Boolean counting, essentially. So this sounds really abstract right now. It's actually a very straightforward procedure, though. So I want to share an illustrative example of how I've used QCA in a multi-year study of Teach for America alumni's career paths. I've conducted this study over the last few years with my colleague at UC Berkeley, Professor Janelle Scott. And we were interested in studying Teach for America because when TFA originally began, it was framed as, well, raise your hand if you've heard of Teach for America. So everybody, okay. So you know how it was originally framed, as an alternative teacher preparation and placement program. Okay? And today, the discourse around TFA is a very different one. Today, TFA self-describes its mission as an organization that aims to prepare educational and social policy leaders. So it sees itself now more as producing alternative teachers and placing them in hard-to-staff settings. Now they're really aiming to produce leaders, excuse me. And we know from the demographic profile of the Teach for America Corps over the last 25 years that it's hovered around, roughly around 14% African American, 11% Latino, and about a quarter of its core includes Corps members who were the first in their family to attend college. That's their proxy for low socioeconomic background. Right? So this is a fairly elite network of actors that's growing quite a bit in public education right now. So why were we interested in studying this? Well, we see TFA as a case of something larger. We see it as an organization that's situated within a broader political and ideological movement in education. And it's part of that right now they're in conversation with others about the project to redefine and redress educational equity. And we've observed that the recruits oftentimes, through our study, we've observed that the recruits come to promote a certain type of policy and a certain type of reform. And we describe these policies as reforms as incentivist policies or market-oriented policies that retain certain themes from the corporate sector. But how do so many of them come to support this particular sort of brand of policy and this brand of reform? Well, we've used QCA to understand what conditions in Corps members' experiences in TFA lead them to support these types of policies as opposed to other public interest-minded, more communitarian focused policies. So I want to give you a little bit of background just so you see where we're going with this and you see how we use the tool to understand what led to this outcome. So we frame this study with theoretical concepts that come out of the political science tradition, and namely the concept of policy entrepreneurs, which comes from Mintrom's work. And Mintrom teaches us that policy entrepreneurs are individuals who take up a cause and they make it part of their political agenda, all right, or they attach it to a pre-existing political agenda. And policy entrepreneurs, Mintrom reminds us, promote market-oriented policies as opposed to public interest policies that are intended to invest in the public bureaucratic system. Okay, so these include charter schools, voucher plans, high-stakes testing, merit pay, the federal turnaround program, for example. And this concept of policy entrepreneurs is used to explain how policies are initiated, how they're considered, and then how they're actually adopted. And he argues that policy entrepreneurs become instrumental in promoting these types of policies that TFA alumni tend to be supporting in our study. More incentivist policies rather than the more public interest minded ones that I was referring to. So if you're looking in the marketplace, in the corporate sector, policy entrepreneurs include individuals that are acting on the strength of their ideas, but not necessarily the strength of the evidence. Right? So Mintrom describes policy entrepreneurs as using rhetoric to bring in support for their ideas, not necessarily evidence. Okay. And then here he said they focus on innovation as the end goal, right? Or changing traditional routines. Okay. Now in the policy-making world, this looks a little different though. Here policy entrepreneurs will dramatize certain issues in order to galvanize public opinion around them. They'll rely on well-developed networks, both social and professional networks of actors to help promote different policies. And they'll frame innovation, like I said, as the solution and focus on change. You'll hear lots of rhetoric around change and innovation. And in this literature, the argument is that by bringing a problem to public prominence and developing and advocating an incentivist policy of innovation, an individual then becomes a policy entrepreneur. So we asked, how do these TFA alumni become policy entrepreneurs? So a little bit of background on the study. We conducted 164 interviews. This is a nationally representative sample of both TFA alumni and current core members. Earlier findings, and I share this just because this gives a little bit of an analytic context for where we were headed in our study to begin with, or where our study sort of began. What we already found through our study is that the TFA engages, as an organization, engages in certain types of messaging with its core members. And they frame the causes of inequality primarily as managerial, bureaucratic problems that are in need of innovative, market-oriented solutions. Think back to Mintrom's definition of policy entrepreneurs. And we've also found that the majority of the alumni in our sample are now working in market-oriented incentivist policy reform settings. And how does that happen? How do so many of them go through the organization and then pursue a very similar career path in the end? And we refer to these career paths as remaining within the TFA ideological echo chamber, right? So CMOs, charter management organizations, corporate-funded reform agencies, for example. Okay. So this is what we were already finding through initial qualitative data analysis. And we did this through conventional iterative coding. But that only got us so far. Right? We had a large sample. We had 117 alumni, which I'll focus on today, not the current core members. But 117 alumni. How do you tease out the specific conditions that are leading them to work in fairly similar agencies when they finish their 2-year commitment or just at different stages in their career? So we asked a couple of questions, and today I'm only going to focus on one question and one answer to it, so you can see how we used QCA. So here we asked, what are the specific combinations of factors that lead TFA alumni to support and promote incentivist policies or reforms? Now we also asked what the specific combinations of factors are that lead the alumni to actually work as policy entrepreneurs, to accept a specific job that would count as a policy entrepreneur. But today I'm just looking at I'll share with you the combinations of factors or conditions that lead them to support these types of policies. So we carried out QCA with this data set. The cases we used were the alumni cases. So we had 117 cases of alumni interviews. So we had interview transcripts. Okay? And based on our initial coding of the transcripts, as well as what the theoretical literature on policy entrepreneurs told us we could expect to find, we selected 7 potential conditions that we hypothesized would be necessary or sufficient for becoming a policy entrepreneur. Okay? And these conditions included the race of the alum, their socioeconomic background, their placement in either a traditional school or a charter school, their sustained involvement in TFA. Did they continually engage with the organization for the decade after they completed their program, or did they pull away? Another condition was whether they attended a university-based traditional graduate school, okay, as opposed to an alternative school where you can go through, I'm thinking of, where you can go through something that's not connected to a university, not necessarily research-based. So, for example, you could go through, I'm blanking right now, I'm thinking of all of these alternative credentialing or higher education programs. New leaders, some would offer up, which that wasn't traditional graduate training. Relay, for example, is a new alternative graduate school, but it's not connected to a traditional research university in New York. Okay, so that's another one. That was another condition that we hypothesized might be connected with their policy entrepreneurship. How many years they spent teaching? Did they only fulfill their 2-year commitment, or stay for a third, or did they stay for much longer? And did that affect this outcome? And then their perceptions of their experience in Teach for America. Were they positive about it, or were they negative about it? Okay, they tended to have in our sample fairly strong opinions one way or the other about their outcomes. So these were all the conditions that we hypothesized may either be necessary or sufficient to lead to them becoming a policy entrepreneur, essentially. Now, before I go into what this looked like, I want to just give you two terms to keep in mind. When you conduct QCA, you're interpreting two figures. Okay, you're interpreting a coverage, a figure for coverage, and a figure for consistency. And both of these are numbers that go from 0 to 1. Okay, so 0.7, 0.2, 0.95. Okay, and coverage, the coverage figure tells you how much of your outcome is explained or covered by the combination of conditions. Okay, so this can be large. It can be very large, your coverage, but it can also be small if you have lots of paths to the same outcome. And this is somewhat analogous to effect size in inferential statistics. So here, coverage gauges the empirical relevance of a combination of factors. Okay, so think of it somewhat like effect size. Okay, and then you also interpret a figure for consistency, also on a 0 to 1 scale. So. Consistency refers to the proportion of cases with a combination of conditions that are subsets of a given outcome. So in QCA, it's conventional to use 0.75 as your cutoff for high consistency, but just like we know from our statistical learning, these cutoffs are somewhat arbitrary. So and that requires some professional judgment on the part of the researcher to decide what you think is a sufficient cutoff, just like we do in statistics. Okay. But 0.75 tends to be the conventional cutoff to say, yes, this combination of conditions was highly consistent. Okay? And this can be analogized to statistical significance, okay? Because it tells whether an empirical connection exists between a subset of conditions and a given outcome. So we're going to talk today about the coverage and the consistency that we found in the conditions, the combinations of conditions that were associated with TFAers becoming policy entrepreneurs. Now, when you use QCA, and you all can Google it, and you can see you can download free QCA software. It now comes in multiple forms. It's quite easy to use, actually. So you can sort of play around in the sandbox with a very small data set if you even just want to create a sample one. But Charles Reagan has a great website that you can go to that'll sort of give you that will give you links to the actual software, and you'll see the steps that you go through to arrive at this truth table. But after we define our cases, define what conditions we want to see are associated, or we define our cases and we define our outcome, and we select the conditions that we think are necessary or sufficient for being associated with this outcome, we then get a truth table. And this is a very modified version of the truth table to only show you a couple of the combinations of conditions that were most associated with becoming a policy entrepreneur. So here are a couple of results from our QCA analysis. And what we see is 4 conditions in this first set of conditions. We see 4 conditions that are highly consistent with leading to policy entrepreneurship. We see the race of the participant, their socioeconomic background, the level of involvement with TFA after they complete the program, and then their enrollment in traditional graduate school. We see a second set of conditions, and I'll define the values, whether we're talking about low SES or high SES, for example, in a moment. We also see another set of conditions that was very associated with policy entrepreneurship, and here race pops up again. Their perceptions of how positive their experience come up in this one. The number of years they spent teaching, in combination with their level of involvement in the program. When we see that what is in both of these cases, if we look over here at consistency, these were highly consistent. Right? So that means these were very frequently associated with policy entrepreneurship. Okay, 0.9 is very high, and 0.86 is also quite high. Coverage around 0.4, that's a moderate level of coverage. And here it's a fairly low level of coverage, 0.24, but it's because we actually in the end had 8 combinations of conditions that were associated with becoming a policy entrepreneur. And when you have that many combinations come up, then coverage goes down. These values go down. So how do we actually interpret something like this? How do we make sense of this based on what our hunches were and based on what we're trying to understand? Well, we interpret these QCA results this way. We can claim now that we know that there are at least two combinations, and I referred to the fact that there are more, but at least two combinations of contextual conditions that lead to TFA alums' support for and promotion of incentivist reforms. So the first combination of conditions means that if you are a TFA alum who is white, who comes from a middle to upper class community, who has no traditional graduate school experience, but who has maintained a moderate to high level of involvement with the organization, your likelihood of becoming a policy entrepreneur is quite high, okay? Here, and for the second set of conditions, we found that if you are white and if you maintain a moderate to high level of engagement with the organization, and if you didn't teach for very long, if you taught for less than 3 years, but you had a positive perception of your experience while you were in the program, then your likelihood of becoming a policy entrepreneur, again, if you look at it's quite high. Okay. So how do we make sense of all of these? Well, overall, we saw there were actually 8 combinations, and some people might say pathways, okay, even though this is not path analysis, but 8 combinations of conditions that were linked with becoming a policy entrepreneur. Well, some people might say, well, what do we do with that? We know that 8 different combinations exist. Well, as a qualitative researcher who studies social phenomena, and if you'll recall at the beginning of the talk, I shared that one of the challenges methodologically to studying urban education is that it's complex. There are multiple things happening at any one time, and anybody who has studied schools, gone through schools, evaluated schools, worked in schools know that these social phenomena are complicated. And so this allows us to say it is complicated, and there are multiple experiences that core members can have that are going to lead them to become a policy entrepreneur. But what we also know is that there are certain conditions that we find are repeatedly that contain repeatedly high consistency and coverage. Right? Race, the race of the participant really matters. Race matters in 7 out of the 8 combinations of conditions. Okay. The socioeconomic background of the participant also matters. In 6 out of 8 of the combinations of conditions, SES mattered. Involvement in TFA. If you stayed engaged with the organization, if you continued to hear that messaging that I foreshadowed earlier, the messaging around certain solutions, policy solutions for inequality, that also predicts your likelihood of becoming a policy entrepreneur. And then the number of years teaching is pretty associated with this outcome as well. So in 6 out of the 8 cases, if you stayed in the classroom beyond 3 years, you were much less likely to support incentivist market-oriented reforms. Okay. So let's talk about this qualitatively. So in other words, when a Teach for America alum is African American or Latino, is from a lower SES background, attains a traditional university-based graduate education, and minimizes his or her exposure to TFA's messaging about the causes of inequality and its solutions. Or if the alum is African American or Latino, has more experience with classroom teaching, but recalls his or her TFA experience negatively and minimizes, again, his or her exposure to the TFA's messaging, then she or he will rarely support and promote incentivist policies or become a policy entrepreneur according to these results. Okay? And we can go on and construct narratives around these now and flesh these out based on our other forms of qualitative evidence about our alumni's experiences and their reflections on their experiences. But we know from this systematic analysis of 117 interviews, we were able to step beyond coding them for certain broad patterns and to say there are 8 specific pathways that lead to these these orientations towards policy and reform. At the end of the day, there are 8. Right? And it's important to see what's not included in there as much as what is included in there. Right? So I want to go ahead and stop here so we can just talk a little bit about the tool as well as sort of applying it in this context and hear from you all about the kinds of questions that you have about QCA as a tool for studying phenomena inside of urban schools. And I think that's about it. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Another question.
Mm-hmm.
When you used QCA, you already had a sense, you have to have a sense of the information from the interviews in order to build the model in the first place. Did any of your results really surprise you? What did it kind of help you see that you couldn't see just through regular?
They did, and in fact I can pull it back up here. If we looked at all of the conditions, let's see, where do I have the conditions? Okay, so we hypothesized that whether they were in a charter school or a traditional public school would really make a difference, because we heard over and over and over again in interviews, well, I was lucky, I was placed in a charter school. There was a frequent quote that we coded for, as opposed to, oh, well, my friend in the program, he was placed in a traditional public school. His experience was much harder, right? And they really, or after the charter school, they went off. They seem to oftentimes go off and work at for a charter agency or charter management organization. We thought that charter placement would really be a part of it. We also thought that when we were originally hypothesizing about conditions, we had a lot of other conditions that we thought would be in place or would also be predictive. Now, something about QCA is you can throw as many conditions in as you can, but it's just like all analyses, it's just going to make your analysis really complicated. So there was also some sort of early attempts to sort of see if we could see any conditions. But certain things didn't pop up. And we thought, and so we had to interpret that as well. And in the forthcoming paper on this, we talk about how charter placement, which seems so profound in people's reflections on their experience, it didn't surface anywhere as being linked with our outcome, and we suspect it's because Teach for America didn't begin placing its recruits in charters until somewhat more recently. So all of our alumni who went through the program for the first 15 years, for example, we had a lot of cases of people who were never had the option to be in a charter or a traditional public school context, for example. So it actually wasn't as strong of a pattern as we thought it was. And I think that oftentimes happens when I'm coding sometimes, I walk away with the impression that something that I keep hearing must be, the strength of it must be stronger than it actually is, or the intensity of that pattern must be stronger than it is, or it must actually also be linked with other outcomes, when in fact this helped us kind of disentangle it. So there were some surprises. That's the biggest one of this list. We've been looking at this data set in all different ways. There were others as well. I think the other thing that it does when you're thinking about, or when you said, well, what does it tell you that you might not have just known anyway, just from your coding, is that it helped us look across multiple patterns and sort of see how often different combinations, for example, this one. In traditional coding, we could have looked and said, okay, we can construct through rigorous means, we can construct a narrative that explains how these 4 conditions really were linked up with this in an individual case or with several cases. But we don't have a way to tell that story across 89 cases or whatever it is. This helps us reduce those narratives into a place where we can show our readers that it's not just us highlighting these illustrative examples. We can reduce it in a way that readers can then see the sort of the strength of those patterns. Does that answer your question?
I'm just kind of struggling to understand how that might be different from the way a quantitative researcher would approach having identified the same kinds of conditions and then constructed a regression.
Yeah. Well, then you're looking
which might
at
belie my lack of
Yeah.
understanding of quantitative
Yeah.
research, or
and then we know that there's an interaction effect, but we don't know what is just correlated. We don't know which variable is just correlated with another variable in a regression. Right? So we have multicollinearity. We have a chance of multicollinearity. We don't know where those correlations they're hidden essentially in that regression. It's hard for you to pinpoint which variables are correlated. Mm-hmm. Here you can actually see it. There it's fuzzy. It's left, an inferential statistician is going to have to say, okay, well, we know that there's some correlation here. We don't know exactly where it is. Here you can spell it out.
in other words, this represents a certain number of individuals who had those,
and that's,
who were in that pathway,
yes.
who had all of those things as opposed to on average.
And the other thing is, if you're looking at some point, and for those of you who have looked at who have engaged in your coding at some point, after a certain number of cases, it becomes difficult to present those findings in a manageable way that's easy to interpret for the reader. I think you can go up to 30, you can go up to 40 interviews easily in certain qualitative analyses. Once it gets to a certain point, it becomes more difficult, I think, to present those patterns in an easily digestible format for somebody. So this also reduces what you're doing on a case-by-case basis anyway in qualitative data.
So I have a question about conditions and how they might have informed or not informed the line of questioning that you used in the quantitative analysis. Like, did you create the conditions and then form qualitative questions? Was it the reverse? Do both types of scenarios happen and sometimes one informs the other? Just how did that process work out for you, and how do you know QCA uses it in the qualitative aspect of it?
So I think I understand your question. Let me repeat it back to you. Tell me if I'm understanding you. So you're asking whether we sort of selected the conditions that we were interested in and then chose QCA?
You selected the conditions, and then the line of questioning that you used to interview the 117 alumni were shaped around those conditions, or did you conduct the interviews with the alumni and then shape those conditions around reoccurring themes in the questioning?
We interviewed the participants based on the interview protocols that we designed came straight out of the theoretical frameworks for the study. Now I talked about policy frameworks because for this paper that is the guiding theoretical concept. We had other theoretical concepts. It's actually an interdisciplinary framework across the entire study. So there were more that informed other questions that we asked. And then when we took, after our initial rounds of coding, then we took a step back and said, okay, what conditions do we see surfacing? We see some patterns. We don't know how often. It's hard to look at that much data. This kind of gets back to it's hard to look at that much qualitative data and see specifically, make sure you're not missing any patterns. So we did it, that was the direction. So that's why it was both a theoretical exercise as well as a substantive exercise based on initial qualitative analyses.
So, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk. Forgive me if this is something you covered and I shouldn't be asking it. But the question I have is about how few cases you think actually can be robustly used with QCA.
It's been used in studies as small as 8 cases. Right? You can use 8. You can do this on a very small scale. It's a tool that helps you look across the conditions. If you imagine a matrix, a little easier, yeah. And just like I don't know if you were in here. for this part, but I talked about some of the assumptions behind qualitative and quantitative research, and really both traditions require judgment calls, where we pick our cutoff, things like that. So Reagan estimates, the originator of the tool, he estimates that 8 is about as small as you can go. I saw a paper that used only 6 cases, but it wasn't fully fleshed out yet, so I don't know how that one turned out. And up to maybe 120, 150, I think is sort of the max. I wanted to say one other thing to Erica. The other thing is the goal in the inferential statistics that you talked about is to predict. Right? It's to predict to a larger population. Right? This isn't predicting. We're saying within this sample, these people had the likelihood of this happening. So here we're not trying to generalize to the entire population of TFA alumni. We're talking about this. Now it's a representative sample, and we sampled like that purposely, but we're also mindful of the fact that we need to remain cautious about the fact that we're not predicting to the broader population of TFA alumni. It's not what the data are intended for.
Why not?
What's that?
Why not? Why would you feel uncomfortable saying something about the broader TFA group, given that this was a representative sample?
I think it's an excellent question. There's a major debate right now in the field about QCA and whether it can be used to establish causality. There are certain QCA researchers who say this is as rigorous as any inferential statistics because both require a degree of subjective decisions on what we accept, as in terms of cutoffs and things. And if you sample according to certain criteria, then yes, you can generalize. You then can actually establish, or you can make some claims of causality. My orientation to research is that in both qualitative and quantitative traditions, even in the most elegant looking experimental design, we only come closer to establishing causality. My orientation, or I assume that we never fully establish causality. So that's more a reflection of my orientation as a researcher.
I mean, I can see that one of the advantages or one of the attractions might be, especially talking to or speaking and writing to an audience that is maybe skeptical about qualitative research, that this could be persuasive to them for a number of reasons. That's N size, if you will, as well as kind of the allure of numbers and the certainty that they represent. So, but I'm wondering how you actually do present it. Do you recontextualize it in what I think of the quantitative
That's
data?
an excellent question, Erica. So if you come to my talk tomorrow, I will be talking about how I presented this in a separate study where it's focusing on the instructional level outcomes that I analyzed with Professor Wolfen at University of Connecticut. When you use QCA, I think it's seductive to say, okay, here's my table, I'm finished. I don't think that this actually helps us as a standalone analysis. I think that it has to be supplemented with another form of data. And when I've presented it now in 2 different studies, I've supplemented the QCA results with conventional qualitative narratives that give the rich contextualized understandings that you lose here, right? So this doesn't give me this doesn't help me see how this happens. It helps me know that these 4 conditions are linked with this, but what does that actually look like? And that's where you get the thick description. So I would argue, and I know Reagan argues, that you don't use QCA alone. You use it in combination with other analyses. So I've presented it with other qualitative narratives that are constructed from conventional coding procedures. So that in the paper that I'm talking about tomorrow, and actually in this paper as well, there are essentially vignettes that come straight from the coding that help animate these patterns.
Quick methodological question related to Reagan's development of this around kind of nation-state level data. Do you think that there are any important differences from a research perspective in using these data at different, with different units of analysis, from the individual to the nation-state? In terms of thinking, for example, about complexity of pathways or how you recontextualize?
I think it's important as a qualitative researcher to be mindful of how unique contexts can be. So if you're looking at a nation state, the major contextual conditions that you're going to identify, those are unique to that unit of analysis. If you're looking at, this is used also in this has just started to be used in the medical field, where they're saying these are the combinations of conditions that are associated with patients' outcomes, then those are much more, those contextual conditions can be associated with the patient's background, the patient's positionality. There's so many things that it could be. I think just being mindful of what contextual factors may matter, and that I'd say that's the first to come to mind. I don't feel like I'm completely answering the question.
I asked it badly. I guess what I'm interested in is when you talked a little bit, for example, about charter schools and why they might have fallen out. I'm wondering more, speaking to qualitative approaches that try to recognize and build ways of understanding around kind of nested models of belonging or of experience or whatever. And so here you're looking at individuals, and what has come to the fore are all individualized experiences, how the person connects to the program and whether the person goes to a college and so forth. Is there a way here, or do you get into a situation here where what is easy to see, the constellation of forces that are easy to see, are related to the primary unit of analysis, and that it's harder to do kind of to nest, particularly an individual, to nest the individual within different kinds of contexts that are probably having significant effects, but may not be easy to capture through this method.
Yeah.
Which is what HLM tried. I mean, there are other approaches that have tried to do it.
Yeah. And you can do that. We could have very easily have put high stakes accountability policies in as a condition, right? Or we could have put different sort of macro level policy conditions. We could have put sort of the state, the political orientation of the state that they're in, whether it has collective bargaining. We could have done all of those things. We could have done it. It wasn't sort of those weren't surfacing as initial trends in the data. Some of these do point to the nestedness of these cases, though, in that, so we can interpret it a couple different ways. Yes, race and SES, that's something individualized, although it's also a reflection of your position in a broader in the broader society. But that's involvement with an organization, and that's an organizational level sort of dynamic at that point. So how many times are you going to these broad TFA or these TFA networking meetings? How many times are you engaging at the organizational level? Not just that's not just focused on your identity at that point. Graduate school, that's also a reflection of institutional knowledge that is being communicated to or developed in the alumni. So this is pointing to the nestedness of some of the cases, but it's not HLM. It's not intended to do it that way. Yeah, I think you can pull in those conditions if you choose that would be at clearly distinct sort of analytic levels. Yeah, we didn't see that in initial coding. More, it would have been in there more.
At lunch, at breakfast, you mentioned though that you were able to notice how, say, different kinds of graduate programs might provide different contexts and have different outcomes. I'm wondering how you kind of were able to see that.
So we actually had to go through every graduate program that was listed, because we realized, this is also a there's also a cutoff here in terms of what we call a traditional program. So we defined, and I don't have the definitions with me. In the paper, we have a definition of what we call traditional university-based graduate programs. So we had to define that. And we chose our cutoff after we looked at every single case of graduate school, and we looked at different criteria. Well, what does it mean to go to Relay compared to getting your master's here, for example? So those criteria are outlined for us, but that was then through a process of going back and establishing those criteria, because TFA also has arrangements right now with many universities where you never have to set foot on a university campus or complete many of the requirements that you would through the university's traditional programs, to where certain universities have specific programs that are just for TFA alumni, and they oftentimes fast track them through the degree. So are you going through the full curriculum, or are you going through sort of the fast track condensed version of that curriculum? It was another area of, or another criterion we considered.
So, but just like from a methods perspective, so then when you then define what all these different programs are, you could how would you see that a particular context, in this case a graduate program, might have a different kind of effect than a different graduate program?
So it's pretty.
Right. Or
What's that?
Sorry, or whether, I mean, because when you're talking about, kind of 10 years of a person's changing sense of things, the graduate school may be an outcome of that, not. I mean,
we also had to.
For time
we had to account for time when the graduate school happened. Yeah, that's all explained in the paper also. Yeah. Which doesn't get back to your initial question. This counts almost any form. We're not trying to reduce what we call like a legitimate graduate school education. Almost everything counts except for the most sort of the most bare bones route to a quick degree.
I know it's 1.
Yeah, it's after 1 o'clock.
So everyone who needs to leave, please feel free, and thank you so much for joining us. Let's give one more round of applause.
Thanks for coming. Great, you're welcome.